You were taught that history does not repeat, that every era is unique, that the forces shaping human civilization are too complex, too deeply entangled in culture and free will and sheer accident to ever be captured by a formula. You were taught this in school. You were taught this implicitly by every news broadcast that treated the latest political crisis as unprecedented, every op-ed that framed the current moment as uncharted territory, every historian who insisted that their discipline is an art, not a science, and that the past offers lessons but never predictions. That framing is comfortable. It is also wrong, not arguably wrong, not a matter of interpretation, demonstrably, empirically, publishably wrong. Because in 2010, a man who had spent his entire career studying bark beetle infestations in American pine forests published a one-page letter in Nature, one of the most prestigious scientific journals on Earth, predicting that the United States would enter a period of serious political instability peaking around 2020. He did not use gut feeling. He did not use political ideology. He did not rely on the kind of vague hand-waving that passes for prediction in the social sciences, where scholars say things like, tensions are rising, and then claim credit no matter what happens. He used a differential equation, a specific, published, falsifiable differential equation. The same class of equation he had been using for 20 years to predict when beetle populations in Georgia and Texas would crash and kill thousands of acres of loblolly pine. He took the math that governs how predator populations overshoot their prey base and collapse, and he applied it to human civilization, to your country, to the economy you participate in every day, to the political system you vote inside of. The prediction was published, time-stamped, peer-reviewed, and then ignored for 10 years. Nobody in mainstream political science engaged with it. The professional historians who should have been paying attention dismissed the entire premise as impossible. Then 2020 arrived. A global pandemic, the largest mass protests in American history. An armed mob storming the United States Capitol. Trust in government institutions falling to the lowest levels ever recorded in polling data. Political polarization measured at levels not seen since the 1850s. Every single trend the equation predicted, moving in exactly the direction it specified, arriving at exactly the time it specified. His name is Peter Turchin, and the part that should disturb you is not that a bug scientist predicted the arc of American politics more accurately than every political analyst, every pollster, every intelligence agency, and every tenured historian in the country combined. The part that should disturb you is what the equation says happens next, because the model does not say 2020 was the peak. It does not say the worst is behind us. It says 2020 was the beginning of a crisis window, and there is a number attached to what happens inside that window. In 75% of documented historical cases with the structural profile America currently has, the result was revolution or civil war. That number comes from the data. It is not speculation. I spent an unreasonable number of hours reading Turchin's actual papers, his books, the data sets he compiled, the academic responses, the dismissals, the grudging acknowledgements, and the increasingly alarmed tone of his public writing over the last 3 years. What I found is a story that nobody is telling you correctly. Not the media, not the academy, and not Turchin himself, who is too disciplined a scientist to say in plain language what his own numbers imply. So, I am going to say it for him. The equation that predicts when civilizations break was written for organisms that do not think, do not vote, do not have cultures or religions or constitutions. And it is still running. Peter Valentinovich Turchin was born on May 22, 1957, in Obninsk, Russia. Obninsk was a Soviet science city, one of those closed towns the USSR constructed around nuclear reactors and classified research facilities, populated almost entirely by physicists and engineers and their families. His father, Valentin Turchin, was a theoretical physicist and cybernetics researcher. But what defined Valentin's life was something far more dangerous than physics. He was a public dissident. Valentin co-founded Moscow's chapter of Amnesty International. He collaborated with Andrei Sakharov, the nuclear physicist who became the conscience of the Soviet human rights movement. He worked alongside Andrei Tverdoklepov. The KGB surveilled the family, harassed them, made professional life progressively impossible. In 1977, the Turchins were expelled from the Soviet Union entirely. I want you to hold that detail, because a boy who watched a superpower's institutional machinery grind his family to pieces, who experienced firsthand what happens when a state's capacity to govern erodes and its elites begin consuming each other, grew into a man who would spend the next 4 decades trying to understand why that happens. Not just in Russia, everywhere, across every civilization in recorded history. The personal and the scientific are the same thread here. They always were. Peter arrived in America and became exactly the kind of immigrant success story the country congratulates itself on producing. Biology degree cum laude from New York University, 1980. PhD in zoology from Duke, 1985. By 1994, a tenured professorship at the University of Connecticut in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, with an adjunct appointment in the mathematics department. He was rigorous, quantitative, and deeply invested in a question that could not have seemed further from geopolitics. Why do bark beetle populations in American pine forests crash on a predictable schedule? His organism of focus was the southern pine beetle, Dendroctonus frontalis. It is roughly the size of a grain of rice. It bores into the inner bark of loblolly and shortleaf pines, lays its eggs in galleries carved through the living tissue of the tree, and in outbreak years can kill millions of trees across the American Southeast. The Texas Forest Service had been tracking these outbreaks for decades, and the data showed a striking cyclical pattern. Major infestations recurring at intervals of roughly 7 to 9 years. 1968, 1976, 1985, 1992, the beetles would explode in population, devastate vast stands of timber, and then crash. The forests would slowly recover, and then, like clockwork, the beetles would explode again. The question was why? What mechanism produced such reliable periodicity? And the answer Turchin found, confirmed through years of fieldwork and mathematical modeling, and ultimately validated in a landmark 1990 paper in Science with collaborators Alan Taylor and Cheryl Reeve, was a predator-prey dynamic with a built-in time delay. A predatory beetle called Phanasimus dubius, the clarid beetle, fed on pine beetle larvae inside their bark galleries. But the clarids reproduced more slowly than their prey. The clarid generation time was longer, which meant the predator population peaked after the prey population had already peaked and begun declining from resource depletion. So the clarids hit their maximum numbers just as the food supply was crashing. They consumed the remaining pine beetles, then starved. Both populations collapsed. The forest recovered. The pine beetles, freed from predation pressure, slowly rebuilt their numbers. And 7 to 9 years later, the cycle repeated. This is described by the Lotka-Volterra equations. If you have taken even a single college-level biology course, you have seen these. They are a pair of coupled differential equations, first derived independently by Alfred Lotka and Vito Volterra in the 1920s. The prey equation says the prey population grows exponentially, but is reduced by encounters with predators. The predator equation says predators reproduce in proportion to how much prey they consume and die at a natural rate when prey becomes scarce. Couple them together, and you get inherently oscillatory dynamics. The populations chase each other in perpetual cycles. Prey multiplies. Predators multiply to exploit the prey. Predators consume so much prey that the prey population crashes. Then the predators, having destroyed their food source, crash too, and the cycle restarts. Rabbits and foxes, hares and lynx, lemmings and Arctic foxes. The Hudson Bay Company has fur trapping records going back to the 1700s that show these oscillations repeating with eerie regularity for centuries. It is one of the most fundamental, most repeatedly confirmed patterns in all of biology. Populations overshoot, then crash. Overshoot, then crash. The math does not care about the species. It cares about the structure of the interaction. Turchin's specific contribution was proving that for the pine beetle system, you could not explain the 7 to 9 year periodicity with simple density dependence alone. You needed second-order, delayed negative feedback, which is the technical way of saying the predator's effect on the prey operates with a time lag. He developed a diagnostic tool he called the R function, plotting the realized per capita growth rate of the population against its own density at various time lags to reveal the signature of delayed feedback. The work was elegant. It was published in Science, which is about as prestigious as ecology gets. It cemented his reputation as one of the leading population dynamicists of his generation. And then in the late 1990s, he walked away from beetles. Not because the work was done, because he had started asking a question that his colleagues found somewhere between eccentric and offensive. What if the same math works on civilizations? What if human societies, with all their complexity and culture, and ideology and apparent uniqueness, obey the same population dynamics as a bark beetle infestation in a Georgia pine forest? What if the reason nobody has noticed is that ecologists do not read history, and historians do not know differential equations? What if the pattern has been sitting in the data for 2,000 years, and the disciplinary walls between fields have made it invisible? That question would cost him nearly 2 decades of professional credibility. But the answer he found was worse than the question. The theoretical framework Turchin reached for was not entirely his invention. It had been proposed in verbal, non-mathematical form by Jack Goldstone, a political scientist at George Mason University, in a 1991 book called Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World. Goldstone had studied state breakdowns in England, France, the Ottoman Empire, and China between 1600 and 1850. His central argument was that revolutions are not caused by single factors, not by bad harvests, not by corrupt rulers, not by foreign wars. They happen when 3 subsystems of society destabilize at the same time. The general population suffers declining well-being, the elite class fragments and turns on itself, and the state loses fiscal capacity and legitimacy. Goldstone presented this as a qualitative model, a set of relationships described in prose. What Turchin did, starting in the early 2000s, was translate those relationships into the language he knew best. Coupled differential equations, the language of population ecology, the language of predators and prey. He called the resulting field Cliodynamics, from Clio, the Greek muse of history, plus dynamics. And the mathematics rests on three interacting variables that, once you see them clearly, make the trajectory of American life since 1970 look less like a series of unfortunate coincidences and more like a system obeying its own internal logic. The first variable is popular immiseration. This tracks the declining well-being of ordinary people, and the key metric is not absolute income, but relative wage, defined as median wage divided by GDP per capita. This distinction is critical because it means you can have a growing economy and a suffering population at the same time. GDP climbs, corporate profits soar, the stock market hits new highs, and the median worker's share of all that growth shrinks. Turchin tracks popular well-being through multiple proxies, including real wages adjusted for inflation, life expectancy trends, average adult stature, the proportion of the population aged 20 to 29, which he calls the youth bulge, and urbanization rates. The stature data is particularly striking. American men lost 4 centimeters of average height between 1830 and 1900, a period of enormous economic expansion. The economy grew. The people inside it literally shrank. The second variable is elite overproduction. This is the one that maps onto Lotka-Volterra dynamics, with a precision that I still find unsettling. In the ecological model, predator populations grow when prey is abundant. In the civilizational model, elite populations grow when the surplus is large. Here is the mechanism. When the relative wage falls, meaning workers are getting a smaller share of output, the surplus available to capital owners increases. That surplus funds wealth accumulation. More people cross the threshold into what Turchin defines as elite status, which he operationalizes as wealth, political influence, or credentialed professional standing. The number of millionaires grows. The number of law graduates grows. The number of people who believe they deserve a seat at the table of power grows. And for a while, this is fine. There is room. Positions are available. The system absorbs them. But the number of genuinely elite positions in any society is structurally limited. There are 100 Senate seats, a finite number of federal judgeships, a fixed number of Fortune 500 CEO positions, a shrinking number of tenure-track professorships. When the number of aspirants exceeds the number of positions, something breaks. Turchin calls it elite overproduction, and the consequences are not theoretical. They are documented repeatedly across every civilization he has studied. Frustrated elite aspirants radicalize. They become what Turchin calls counter-elites. These are people with the education, the ambition, the social networks, and the burning sense of entitlement needed to lead, but without the institutional positions to channel that ambition constructively. So they channel it destructively. They attack the existing order. They fund populist movements. They launch alternative media empires. They bankroll insurgent political campaigns. They frame the established elite as corrupt, decadent, out of touch. They harness the genuine grievances of the immiserated population as fuel for their own ascent. And they tear the institutional fabric apart, not because they are idealists, because they are predators who have run out of prey. The third variable is state fiscal distress. As elite competition intensifies, elites resist taxation. Every dollar going to the state is a dollar unavailable for outcompeting rival elites. Simultaneously, the costs of governance rise because the consequences of instability, policing, military commitments, social programs to pacify a restless population, servicing accumulated debt, all grow. Revenue shrinks while expenditures balloon. The state borrows, debt mounts, and as services degrade and the government visibly fails to manage the crisis, public trust collapses. Trust in the federal government, which polled above 70% in the early 1960s, has been in secular decline for 5 decades. By 2005, multiple surveys described institutional trust as being at historic lows. Turchin combines these 3 variables multiplicatively in what he calls the political stress index. Popular discontent times elite mobilization potential times state fiscal weakness. The multiplicative structure is the mathematical key to the whole framework. It means the system only detonates when all 3 deteriorate simultaneously. Any single variable in crisis is manageable. 2 out of 3 produces turbulence, but not collapse. All 3 together is what came before the fall of the Roman Republic, the English Civil War, the French Revolution, the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, and the American Civil War. And Turchin did not just theorize about this, he tested it, case by case, century by century, in painstaking, granular, archival detail. In 2009, he and his collaborator, Sergei Nefedov, published a book through Princeton University Press called Secular Cycles. It analyzed 8 complete civilizational cycles spanning 2,000 years of human history. Each cycle lasted roughly 200 to 300 years. Each passed through the same 4 phases: expansion, which is the integrative period of growth, rising, well-being, and elite cooperation; stagflation, where population growth begins pressing against resources and the first signs of strain appear; crisis, which is the phase of state breakdown, civil war, elite fragmentation, and mass suffering; and depression, where population declines through violence, famine, and disease. Elite ranks are decimated, and the system resets for a new expansion. I want to walk you through one of these cases in detail, because the specificity of the data is what makes this credible, and the pattern is what makes it deeply uncomfortable. The Roman Republic. The integrative phase ran from roughly 350 to 130 BCE, 2 centuries of expansion. Population grew steadily. Military victories brought wealth, territory, and slaves flowing into the system. The backbone of both the economy and the army was the smallholding citizen farmer, a man who owned a modest plot of land, served in the legions when called, and returned home to his fields when the campaign ended. Elite numbers were manageable. The Senate, for all its internal politics, functioned. The Republic was solvent. Cooperation norms, what the 14th century Arab historian Ibn Khaldun called asabiya, collective solidarity, were high. Then, sometime around 130 BCE, a structural threshold was crossed. The mechanism was what Turchin calls the wealth pump, and it operated with brutal simplicity. Victorious generals and senatorial families used the wealth from foreign conquests to buy up agricultural land. They consolidated small farms into vast estates called latifundia, which could stretch over 500 jugera, roughly 300 acres. And they worked these estates with slave labor captured in those same foreign wars. The slaves were cheaper than free workers. The small farmers could not compete. They lost their land. They flooded into Rome, creating a massive urban underclass with no property, no prospects, and no stake in the system. The relative wage collapsed, but elite numbers swelled. The senatorial class expanded. Equestrian wealth grew. More and more families claimed the status, the lifestyle, and the political ambitions of Rome's ruling class. And the positions of real power had not expanded to match. The competition intensified. Tiberius Gracchus saw this and tried to fix it. In 133 BCE, he proposed a land reform that would redistribute public lands to the dispossessed farmers. For this, he was beaten to death on the steps of the Capitoline Hill by a mob of fellow senators wielding broken chair legs and pieces of furniture. That was the first political murder in 4 centuries of republican governance. Think about what that means. A political system that had operated for 400 years without a single political killing crossed that line in a single afternoon. And once crossed, it could not be uncrossed. His brother Gaius tried similar reforms 10 years later and met the same fate. His supporters were hunted through the streets. Within a generation, Lucius Cornelius Sulla marched his army on Rome itself, the first general in history to do so, and conducted a systematic purge of his political enemies. Sulla's proscriptions eliminated roughly a third of the senatorial class. Names were posted on public lists. Anyone could kill a proscribed man and claim a bounty. Property was confiscated. This was not a revolution from below. This was elite self-cannibalization. The predator class had overshot its carrying capacity and was now eating itself. The crisis phase lasted roughly a century. Marius and Sulla, Pompey and Caesar, Octavian and Mark Antony. Civil war after civil war, political murders became routine. Armies served their generals rather than the republic. The institutional architecture that had sustained Rome for centuries was torn apart by the very class it was designed to serve. And when you plot the data Turchin compiled, including coin hoards buried during periods of instability, which is a proxy for public fear, building activity in the city of Rome as a measure of state investment, and even lead pollution deposits in Greenland ice cores, which serve as a proxy for Roman industrial and mining output. The curves follow the secular cycle model with a fidelity that is very difficult to explain away as coincidence. Turchin found the same pattern in 7 other cases. Plantagenet, England, 1150 to 1485, where the crisis phase produced the Peasants' Revolt and the Wars of the Roses. Tudor Stuart, England, 1485 to 1730, where the crisis phase was the English Civil War. Capetian, France, Valois, France, where the French wars of religion map precisely onto the intra-elite competition phase. Pre-revolutionary France, where decades of educational expansion had produced a class of credentialed professionals, lawyers, journalists, pamphleteers, whose expectations far outpaced the positions available to them. Muscovy, Russia, where the crisis produced the time of troubles and may have killed half the population, and Romanov, Russia, where the cycle terminated in the Bolshevik Revolution. 8 cases, 8 datasets, assembled from price series, wage records, tax receipts, census data, land records, noble genealogies, military records, and chronicles spanning 8 centuries. The same 4 phases, the same 3 variables, the same dynamics every single time. I want to linger on France for a moment, because the French case contains a detail that connects directly to the American present in a way that should make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Pre-revolutionary France in the 18th century experienced exactly the same structural dynamics. The wealth pump was running at full capacity. The aristocracy and the upper bourgeoisie accumulated enormous wealth, while peasant incomes stagnated and the urban working class suffered declining real wages. Bread prices, which were the most important single variable in ordinary French life, climbed relentlessly through the 1770s and 80s. A bad harvest in 1788 pushed them to crisis levels. But here is the part that maps onto the present with disturbing precision. France had simultaneously experienced decades of educational expansion. The number of lawyers, journalists, pamphleteers, minor officials, and credentialed professionals had swelled far beyond the positions available to them. The old regime reserved the highest offices, the most prestigious military commissions, the most lucrative church benefices for the hereditary nobility. A brilliant, ambitious, university-educated commoner could rise only so far before hitting a ceiling that no amount of talent or education could breach. The result was a generation of frustrated aspirants with the skills, the ambition, and the righteous indignation to articulate popular grievances, but without the institutional positions to channel that energy constructively. These were Turchin's counter-elites, and they did not just participate in the revolution, they led it. Robespierre was a provincial lawyer. Danton was a provincial lawyer. Marat was a failed physician turned journalist. Desmoulins was a lawyer who could not find clients. The Committee of Public Safety was staffed almost entirely by men whose professional ambitions had been blocked by the structure of the old regime. They harnessed the genuine suffering of the French population, the bread riots, the rural desperation, the urban poverty, and they used it as fuel for their own ascent. And when they reached the top, they turned on each other. Danton guillotined. Desmoulins guillotined. Eventually, Robespierre himself guillotined. Revolution devoured its children. The same phrase Turchin used in 2025 to describe what his model predicts for the current American political moment. The parallel is not loose, it is structural. A society with declining popular well-being, a surplus of credentialed aspirants locked out of elite positions, and a state too fiscally strained and institutionally weak to mediate the conflict. That is France in 1789. And according to every metric Turchin tracks, it is America right now. When Turchin began publishing this work in the early 2000s, the academic response was not hostility so much as bewilderment. He was an ecologist. He had no credentials in history, no credentials in political science, no credentials in sociology. He was publishing in ecology journals about human population dynamics, and nobody in any of those fields knew quite what to do with him. He founded the peer-reviewed journal Cliodynamics in 2010 through the University of California's e-scholarship platform. The journal was indexed in Scopus. It published legitimate, peer-reviewed, quantitative history, and it was, for years, essentially a one-man operation surrounded by a small circle of collaborators, most of them from outside traditional history departments. The loneliness of that position is easy to underestimate. Turchin was not a crank. He was a tenured professor at a major research university, publishing in Nature and Science, and +1, with rigorous mathematical training and a track record of empirical work that had been validated in ecology. But the work he was now doing fell into a disciplinary no man's land. Ecologists did not care about the French Revolution. Historians did not understand differential equations. Political scientists had their own frameworks and were not interested in being told that a bug scientist had found a better one. Former American Historical Association President Lynn Hunt had asked in 2002, "Where have all the theories gone?" The answer was that the theories had moved to a different department and nobody had noticed. And so Turchin worked in relative isolation for nearly 15 years, building datasets, publishing papers, refining models, and watching the political stress index climb toward the threshold that his data said would produce crisis. He knew what was coming. He published what was coming, and he sat in his office in Connecticut while nobody listened. I want to stop here and make sure the weight of this framework lands properly, because the three variables I just described, popular immiseration, elite overproduction, and state fiscal distress, are not abstract categories. They are measurable. Turchin measures them. And when he plots them for the United States from 1780 to the present, the graphs tell a story that is impossible to look away from once you see it. To make this work, Turchin needed data, enormous amounts of data. He needed wage records and price series going back centuries. He needed counts of political violence events, not estimates, not approximations, actual documented incidents compiled from newspapers, government records, and court proceedings. He needed to track wealth distribution, congressional behavior, elite demographics, and state finances across 230 years of American history. And the reason this project took him over a decade is that most of this data did not exist in any unified, analyzable form. He had to build the dataset himself. The result was the most comprehensive quantitative history of the United States ever assembled. 1,590 political violence events between 1780 and 2010, each individually documented and coded. Real wages for unskilled and semi-skilled workers, tracked annually using multiple historical wage series. GDP per capita assembled from economic historians' reconstructions. Wealth distribution data drawn from tax records, estate inventories, and census wealth supplements. Congressional polarization calculated from roll call voting patterns using DW nominate scores. The number of self-funded political candidates tracked election by election. College tuition expressed as a ratio of the annual wage of a manufacturing worker. A series he managed to construct going all the way back to 1840. Average adult male stature compiled from military enlistment records, which serves as a biological marker of childhood nutrition, and therefore of the material conditions ordinary families experienced during the subject's growing years. When you plot all of these on the same timeline, something emerges that individual data series cannot show. Everything moved together, not randomly, not independently, in coordinated waves that match the structural demographic model's predictions with unnerving precision. The first integrative phase, which Turchin calls the era of good feelings, after the political period of the same name, ran from the founding through roughly the 1820s. Relative wages were high because labor was scarce in a vast, underpopulated continent. Elite numbers were modest. The state was fiscally healthy. Political violence was low. Cooperation norms were strong. The republic functioned. The reversal began around 1830. Immigration surged. particularly from Ireland and Germany, the labor supply began outstripping demand. Relative wages declined. Simultaneously, the slave-holding southern planter class and the northern industrial elite both expanded aggressively, accumulating wealth and political influence. The fraction of the population that could be classified as elite grew from approximately 1% to roughly 2% by 1860 and 3% by 1870. These numbers may seem small, but in a system with finite elite positions, even a doubling of the aspirant population creates intense competition. And that competition, in Turchin's model, is what shattered the antebellum political order. The PSI for the 1850s does not rise gradually, it spikes. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Each of these events is typically taught as an individual cause or contributing factor to the Civil War. In Turchin's framework, they are symptoms. They are the surface expressions of a structural crisis that was baked into the population dynamics decades earlier. The wealth pump was running. The elites were overshooting. The state, torn between incompatible elite factions, was losing its capacity to mediate. The equation was producing its output. The specific trigger, slavery, was contingent. The structural explosion was not. The war killed more than 600,000 people. 1/4 of military-aged white men in the South died. The planter elite was decimated. Land was redistributed. However briefly, the wealth pump was disrupted and the cycle reset. The second integrative phase built slowly through the progressive era and accelerated dramatically with the New Deal. Franklin Roosevelt's reforms, labor legislation, progressive taxation, social insurance programs, represented in Turchin's framework exactly the kind of structural intervention that can prevent a crisis from recurring. The wealth pump was reversed. The relative wage climbed. Union membership peaked in the 1950s at roughly 1/3 of the workforce. The top marginal income tax rate exceeded 90% under Eisenhower. Inequality declined to historic lows. The ratio of CEO compensation to average worker pay, which had been relatively modest throughout the mid-century, remained in the range of 20-1. This is the period Turchin describes as the golden age for common Americans, and it was not an accident. It was the product of specific policy choices that addressed specific structural pressures. The wealth pump was identified, perhaps not in those terms, and shut down. Elite competition was moderated through high taxation and regulatory constraint. The state was strengthened through expanded capacity and rising public trust. All three variables moved in the right direction. The PSI declined, stability prevailed, and then it ended. Around 1970, every trend reversed. The specific mechanisms are debatable. Some economists point to the end of Bretton Woods. Others cite the oil shocks of 1973 and 79. Others emphasize the deliberate policy choices of the Reagan era: deregulation, tax cuts for high earners, the weakening of organized labor. Turchin does not insist on a single cause because the structural demographic model does not require one. What the model requires is that the wealth pump reactivates, that the relative wage begins declining while the surplus flowing to capital owners begins increasing. And that is exactly what the data show, regardless of which proximate cause you prefer. Real wages for American workers, adjusted for inflation, peaked in approximately 1973 and have been essentially flat or declining since. depending on which deflator you use and which segment of the workforce you measure. During the same period, GDP per capita roughly tripled. The economy grew enormously. The workers inside it did not share in that growth. The relative wage fell. The surplus flowed upward. The wealth pump was running again. And the elite population responded exactly as the model predicts. The number of American households with a net worth exceeding $10 million began growing exponentially. The number of billionaires climbed from a handful in the early 1980s to over 900 by 2025. Law school enrollment surged through the 1980s and 90s, producing far more graduates than the legal profession could absorb. MBA programs expanded dramatically. The percentage of Americans with bachelor's degrees climbed from roughly 11% in 1970 to over 37% by 2020. But the wage premium for those degrees eroded as supply outstripped demand. More credentialed people chasing positions that were not multiplying at the same rate. Meanwhile, the state's fiscal position deteriorated on exactly the trajectory the model describes. The national debt, which had been declining as a share of GDP since World War II, began its long climb in the 1980s. Tax revenues were constrained by elite resistance to taxation, manifesting as a bipartisan consensus against rate increases that held for decades. Expenditures grew as the government took on new military commitments, expanded entitlements, and faced the rising costs of managing an increasingly strained society. The gap between revenue and expenditure widened. Debt accumulated, and public trust in institutions, which had polled above 70% in the early 60s, began its secular decline. By 2020, the figure had fallen below 20% in most surveys. Every component of the political stress index was moving in the direction the model says leads to crisis. Popular immiseration increasing, elite overproduction increasing, state fiscal distress increasing. The PSI was climbing. And there is something I want you to notice about the timing, because this is the detail that transforms the model from an interesting academic exercise into something that should genuinely concern you. The reversal happened around 1970. The predicted crisis window, based on the 50-year fathers and sons cycle superimposed on the longer secular wave, was 2020. That is a 50-year lag between the structural reversal and the predicted crisis. 50 years during which the pressures built invisibly, year by year, below the threshold of public attention. The economy looked fine from the surface. GDP was growing, markets were rising, technology was advancing. But underneath, the relative wage was falling, the elite population was swelling, the state was weakening, and the political stress index was climbing toward the zone where every prior civilization in Turchin's database had experienced crisis. The people who should have been watching these indicators were not watching them, because the people whose job it was to understand historical dynamics, the historians, had abandoned quantitative methods 3 decades earlier, and the people whose job it was to study population dynamics, the ecologists, had no idea the same math applied to human societies. The disciplinary walls that divide academia had made the most important signal in American political life invisible to everyone except one man who happened to have a foot in both worlds. And when that man published his prediction in the most prestigious science journal on Earth, the response was silence. It was not until the Graham Wood profile in The Atlantic in November 2200 that Turchin received significant mainstream attention. Wood's opening line captured the bitter irony. The year 2020 has been kind to Turchin. for many of the same reasons it has been hell for the rest of us. Suddenly, the man who had been ignored for a decade was being quoted in Time, Vice, the BBC, Newsweek, and the New Statesman. He was invited to the Hoover Institution by Niall Ferguson. Ross Douthat of the New York Times, who had been skeptical, wrote that at this point, "I feel like you have to pay a little more attention to him." In 2021, Turchin was elected a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a significant validation from mainstream science. But the validation came with a cost, because the question everyone wanted answered was the wrong question. Everyone wanted to know, did you really predict 2020? That is a yes or no question. And the answer is yes. The right question, the one almost nobody was asking, is what does the model say about 2030, about the next decade? And the answer to that question is the reason I made this video. To put all of this on empirical footing, to make it something more than one man's pattern matching, Turchin did something no historian had ever attempted. He built a database, not a small database, not a departmental project with a few thousand entries, a civilizational database. In 2011, he co-founded the Seshat Global History Databank with Harvey Whitehouse, a cognitive anthropologist at Oxford, and Peter Francois, a historian at Hertfordshire who had established the world's first dedicated Cliodynamics lab in 2015. The project is named after the ancient Egyptian goddess of wisdom and record-keeping, which is fitting, because what they were attempting to do was record the structural parameters of every significant human society in history and make those parameters analyzable. The scale of the project is difficult to overstate. Seshat currently tracks 861 polities across 47 regions in 10 macro regions, spanning from roughly 4000 BCE through the early modern period. Its companion geospatial dataset, called Cleopatra, extends from 3400 BCE to 22,000 records on worldwide states and political entities. The main databank contains roughly 300,000 individual records across dozens of variable categories, 26 general variables with nearly 9,000 records, 77 social complexity variables with over 26,000 records, 49 warfare variables with over 17,000 records, plus dedicated modules for religion, economics, and a specialized Crisis DB module that tracks instability events, power transitions, and political violence. Every entry includes narrative paragraphs explaining the evidence, source references to the scholarly literature, and footnotes documenting the basis for each coding decision. Over 100 expert scholars from institutions including Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, Stanford, Brown, Northwestern, and the Field Museum contribute their specialized knowledge. Funding has come from the John Templeton Foundation, the UK Economic and Social Research Council, the European Union Horizon 2020 programme, and the Trico Astle Foundation. Think about what this means. A population ecologist who studied bark beetles built from scratch the most comprehensive quantitative database of human civilizational complexity ever assembled, because he needed it, because the data did not exist in the form he required, and if he wanted to test his equations against the full sweep of human history, he had to create the empirical infrastructure himself. Gary Feynman of the Field Museum praised the project for helping to demolish the academic knowledge silos that have emerged with increases in specialization. What Feynman was describing is the same disciplinary wall that had made Turchin's insights invisible. For decades, the ecologists did not read history. The historians did not know differential equations, and the data that could bridge the gap did not exist until Turchin and his collaborators built it, and the data confirmed the pattern. Across every civilization Seshat has measured, the structural demographic cycle repeats. The same 3 variables, the same 4 phases, the same dynamics. For 2,000 years, in 2016, Turchin published Ages of Discord, applying the complete model to American history. The data he had compiled for the United States were as granular as anything in Seshat. 1,590 documented political violence events, wage series going back to the founding, wealth distribution tracked through tax records and estate data, congressional polarization measured through roll call voting patterns, self-funded political candidates counted election by election, college tuition ratios calculated back to 1840, average adult stature compiled from military records. The political stress index he calculated from all this data tells a story in 2 waves. The first American age of discord peaked in the 1850s and 60s. The PSI spiked as the slave-holding planter class and northern industrial elite competed for incompatible visions of the country's future. The Civil War killed more than 600,000 people and effectively destroyed the southern elite class. The system reset. The second integrative phase, built through the Progressive Era and the New Deal, produced the most stable and broadly prosperous period in American history. Then, around 1970, every indicator reversed. Relative wages peaked, inequality bottomed. Elite numbers began growing, state debt began climbing, trust began falling. The PSI turned upward and did not stop. Scott Alexander, reviewing the book, wrote a line that I think captures the bizarre situation Turchin found himself in. I feel like somebody should either be violently debunking this or else throwing the authors a ticker tape parade for having solved history. Neither is happening. Neither happened because the book was published on October 2nd, 2016 by a small independent press called Beresta Books, not by an academic publisher with a marketing department. It was written by an ecologist, not a historian, and it made claims that, if taken seriously, would require the entire discipline of history to reconsider its foundational assumptions about whether the past contains predictable patterns. The path of least resistance was to ignore it. On February 4th, 2010, Nature published Turchin's prediction, Volume 463, Issue 7281, page 608. 1 page, a correspondence piece, not even a full research article. The opening line was direct. The next decade is likely to be a period of growing instability in the United States and Western Europe. He named 4 indicators that had all experienced turning points during the 1970s. Stagnating or declining real wages, a growing gap between rich and poor, overproduction of young graduates with advanced degrees, and exploding public debt. He wrote that these seemingly disparate social indicators are actually related to each other dynamically. His word, dynamically, the same word you use to describe predator-prey interactions. The prediction was explicitly counter-trend. Political violence in Western democracies had been declining for decades by 2010. The standard trajectory was downward. Predicting an increase was not extrapolating existing data. It was predicting a reversal based on underlying structural pressures that were invisible to anyone who was not tracking all 3 variables simultaneously. It was exactly the kind of prediction that, if wrong, would end a career, and nobody took it seriously. As Turchin later told Time magazine, "They had no reason to believe I was not crazy. People did not understand that I was making scientific predictions, not prophecies." The philosopher of science, Massimo Pigliucci, offered a measured critique that reveals the broader intellectual resistance. He wrote that the database was too short, covering only 230 years, during which you could fit at most 4 50-year peaks. He argued that the observed pattern could be random noise, and on purely statistical grounds, this is a legitimate concern. 4 data points is not a large sample. But Pigliucci's critique applies to the American data in isolation. It does not address the 8 independent civilizational cycles documented in secular cycles, which together span 2 millennia and show the same dynamics repeating across completely different cultures, economies, and political systems. A peer reviewer of Turchin's chapter for the Santa Fe Institute Press was more revealing. Cliometrics went under. By the early 90s, the reviewer wrote, "Our own quantitative historian was denied tenure in approximately 1996. By that point, no one really cared about the subject." This is not a critique of the science. This is an admission that the professional incentive structure punished anyone who tried to do this kind of work. The field was not refuted, it was defunded. Then 22 arrived. A pandemic that killed over 1 million Americans and shattered confidence in public health institutions. The murder of George Floyd and the largest sustained protests in American history. A surge in homicides in major cities. An armed mob storming the Capitol building on January 6, 2021, attempting to overturn a presidential election. Trust in government, which had already been declining for 5 decades, fell to what multiple surveys described as record lows. Political polarization reached levels that quantitative measures have not recorded since the years immediately before the Civil War. Turchin and his collaborator Andrei Korotayev published a retrospective assessment in PLOS ONE in 2020. Their conclusion was precise. Anti-government demonstrations and riots increased dramatically during the 2010 to 2020 decade across the United States, United Kingdom, and Western Europe. The predicted trend reversal was confirmed by the data. The timing matched. The direction matched. The mechanisms matched. A population ecologist who studied beetle swarms had outperformed the entire political science establishment, and the response from that establishment was breathtaking in its refusal to engage with the core finding. Francis Fukuyama wrote what Turchin himself acknowledged was an appropriately scathing review of end times, arguing that the definition of elite was too flexible. He is able to detect elite overproduction in so many historical errors because he has a flexible definition of elite, Fukuyama wrote. Yasha Mounk published an essay in Persuasion titled, "There is no surplus elite in America." The New Statesman ran a piece headlined, "Peter Turchin's Empty Prophecies." A 2023 paper in PLOS ONE by an independent researcher found the 3 core predictions not supported by the data for industrialized societies, arguing that automation explains wage polarization better than labor oversupply. I want you to think about what happened here. A man published a specific prediction in Nature in 2010. He named the decade. He named the mechanisms. The prediction came true. And the professional response was to argue about definitions, to question whether automation or immigration was the real driver, to publish essays with titles calling the entire enterprise empty, This is the institutional pattern Turchin has documented across every civilization in his database. The mechanism is never a conspiracy. It is never a cabal of powerful people suppressing truth. It is something more banal, and therefore more durable. Professional norms, career incentives, the social enforcement of acceptable questions. When a result threatens the foundational assumptions of a discipline, the discipline does not engage with the result. It attacks the method. It questions the definitions. It demands more data. And it moves on. First, the claim was impossible. Then, when the evidence mounted, it was trivial. The one thing it could never be was important. But I need you to understand something that most coverage of Turchin misses entirely. The prediction was never the point. The prediction was a demonstration, a proof of concept. It was Turchin showing that the model could produce testable forecasts. The point is the mechanism. The point is what the model says about the structural dynamics operating in your society right now. And this is where most journalism on the subject stops. Because what the model says about right now is genuinely frightening. The model does not say 2020 was the peak. I need to be very clear about this, because the popular narrative has absorbed Turchin's work into a comforting frame. He predicted 2020. 2020 was bad, and now we are past the worst. That is not what the data say, not remotely. Historical crisis periods drawn from Turchin's database of roughly 100 documented cases across every civilization in the Seshat Databank last a minimum of 10 to 15 years. The median is longer. The American precedent is sobering. The first age of discord ran from the 1850s through the 1920s. That is approximately 70 years, and it included the most devastating war in American history. In 75% of historical cases where the structural profile matches what America is currently experiencing, where popular immiseration, elite overproduction, and state fiscal distress are all elevated simultaneously, the outcome was some form of convulsive state breakdown, revolution, civil war, territorial fragmentation, regime change. In approximately 20% of cases, structural reforms prevented breakdown. The New Deal is the classic example. Progressive taxation, labor protections, and redistribution that shut down the wealth pump. In the remaining cases, the outcome was prolonged decline without a single dramatic rupture, a slow bleeding rather than an explosion. Turchin himself has grown progressively darker in his assessments over the last 3 years, and I think tracing that shift is important because it tracks the model's own trajectory. In his 22-3 book End Times, subtitled Elites, Counter-Elites, and the Path of Political Disintegration, he wrote that it is too late to avert our current crisis, that the structural pressures had built to a point where some form of crisis was now unavoidable. But he still expressed hope that the crisis could be managed, that it could follow the reform path rather than the breakdown path. By January 2005, writing on his Substack called Cliodynamics, his tone had shifted considerably. When I wrote my book 2 years ago, I described the United States as being in a revolutionary situation, he wrote. Now, I would say we are in a true revolution. He characterized the current political moment as a counter-elite seizure, a revolution of the elites. One faction attempting to replace the established elite with its own members. He pointed to the historical pattern documented across every revolution in his data. Revolutionaries who come to power eventually start fighting among themselves. Revolution devours its children. In a separate 2005 interview, he was even more explicit about the risk. So far, I am encouraged that we have not seen large-scale violence, but we are in a very fragile situation. If one group starts using violent methods, the other side will respond, and that could escalate into a civil war. Territorial fragmentation, similar to the American Civil War of the 1860s, is also possible. He pointed to specific states resisting federal authority as potential fault lines, and the structural indicators that feed the model have not improved. They have worsened. The number of American billionaires rose from 835 in 2000 to 924 in 2005. The number of individuals worth $10 million or more has grown tenfold in 4 decades, while real wages have stagnated. Economic modeling estimates that roughly twice as many law graduates pass the bar each year as there are legal job openings for them, producing what Turchin describes as a bimodal salary distribution, where new lawyers either make partner-track salaries or poverty wages, with almost nothing in between. Adjunct teaching at poverty wages is the standard employment model in American higher education, where the majority of courses are now taught by contingent faculty with no job security, no benefits, and no path to advancement. In 2002, 36 candidates spent over $1 million of their own personal wealth on political campaigns. In the entire decade of the 1990s, the total was 1. These are not anecdotes selected to support a narrative. These are the proxy variables for the predator population in a Lotka-Volterra system, and every single one of them is still climbing. The wealth pump has not been shut down, it has accelerated. Elite competition has not been moderated, it has intensified. The state has not been strengthened. Government positions have been eliminated by the thousands through efficiency initiatives, which, in Turchin's framework, does not alleviate elite overproduction. It makes it worse, because every position eliminated is one fewer seat at the table, one more frustrated aspirant, one more potential counter-elite, one more unit of pressure on a system that is already past its structural limits. I personally still do not know how to sit with what this model implies about human agency, about whether knowing the equation changes the outcome, about whether a civilization that understands its own population dynamics can choose to break the cycle, or whether understanding it is just another variable the equation already accounts for. I have gone back and forth on this for weeks. Turchin himself believes reform is theoretically possible. He points to the 20%. He says the preconditions are known. Shut down the wealth pump, strengthen labor, tax progressively, build elite consensus around moderation. But he also concedes that the current moment displays none of those preconditions, not one, and the window for implementing them is narrowing. Think about what that means. An equation written for bark beetles in Georgia pine forests, tested on predator-prey systems in laboratories where the stakes were a few thousand dead trees, has been applied to the most powerful civilization in human history. And it fits. It fits the Roman Republic. It fits Tudor England. It fits pre-revolutionary France. It fits antebellum America. It fits the trajectory of the last 50 years of American life with a precision that should make you deeply uncomfortable. And it says the crisis window does not close for years, maybe decades. Peter Turchin's father was expelled from a country whose institutional machinery had turned predatory. Peter Turchin watched the Soviet system devour its own. He watched elite factions consume each other. He watched the state lose the capacity to hold things together. He watched the cycle run to completion. And then he put his son on a plane to the country that was supposed to be different. His son grew up in that country, became a scientist in that country, and then found in the equations he had written for beetles the same dynamics running underneath his adopted home. The same wealth pump, the same elite overshoot, the same delayed feedback, the same crash. The cycle runs whether you know about it or not. It ran in Rome for a century before the Republic collapsed. It ran in France for decades before the Bastille was stormed. It ran in Russia for a generation before the Romanovs were executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg. It ran in America for 30 years before Fort Sumter. It does not send warnings. It does not ask permission. It does not care that you are listening to this right now and hoping the 20% number is the one that applies to you. The equation was written for organisms that do not think, do not vote, and do not have free will. It was published in the most prestigious science journal on Earth. It named the decade. It named the mechanisms. It was dismissed by every institution whose job it was to listen. And then it came true. And it is still running. The variables have been measured. The trajectory has been plotted. The inputs have not changed. The equation does not know your name, but it knows your number.